Je pense sans cesse à toi.
Hello and welcome to The Foretop. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot-button topics in food and beverage. I'm your host, Catherine Cole. Episode 44 is a celebration of the grande dame of cookery, Julia Child, and her very talented and undersung husband, Paul. We will discuss their relationship, Paul's photography, and their life philosophies. I'm joined for this episode by Alex Prud'homme, author of many books, including My Life in France, which he co-wrote with Julia Child. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
And photography curator Katie Pratt, who co-authored with Alex the new book, France is a Feast, The Photographic Journey of Paul and Julia Child. Hi, Katie.
Hi.
And Karen Karbo, the novelist and nonfiction writer behind the book Julia Child Rules, Lessons on Savoring Life. Welcome.
Salut.
Salut.
Getting the French thing going already.
Well, let's dive into our first course, the importance of love in passion. Alex Prud'homme, looking at the photos in your new book, France is a Feast, The Photographic Journey of Paul and Julia Child, I'm so struck by the love story between these two people. It gets me to thinking that the best way to enjoy a personal passion, such as food, travel, or photography, is to have a life partner who is also passionate about that thing. So I'd love to hear from you just about Paul and Julia's personal relationship and the ways in which they connected over their shared interests.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, basically, this book, France is a Feast, is a love story. Paul and Julia met during the Second World War at the other end of the earth in Sri Lanka. They didn't like each other at first. She thought he had a big nose and an ugly mustache. He thought that she laughed too much and was too silly. But their offices adjoined, and they kind of hit it off after a while, and they started to go out and taste food together. And then they went aboard an elephant into the jungle to visit the Temple of the Tooth. And they had this shared interest in books and food and adventure, which eventually blossomed into marriage. And then he took her to France in 1948, and she fell in love with food and French cooking. And the love is about, of course, their relationship, but it's also a love for France, a love for food, the people and the places that they encountered along the way. They just had such a good time. I mean, as Julia said, she was having so much fun, she barely caught her breath the whole time that they were there. And the thing that's really remarkable about the marriage is that for the first half of it, Paul was the senior member. He was 10 years older than Julia. He was a gourmet. He had lived in France in the 20s. And he was the diplomat who brought her there. He retired in 1961. They moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts. And that's the same year that her first cookbook, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, came out, at which point they went through a role reversal. And Julia became the senior member of the relationship. And Paul was very happy about that. And that was remarkable even then, or especially then. It would be remarkable even now, I meant to say. And he was very supportive, and he liked to be the guy behind the scenes and put her forward. So it's their relationship worked on many different levels.
I think one of the things that, well, first of all, I want to say, Katie and Alex, I am so honored and privileged to be here. I knew people who knew Julia. I interviewed people for my book who knew Julia. I met her once at a book signing. That was my main intersection with Julia. But I sort of come from, that California place. I grew up in a suburb very close to Julia's. And I think one of the things that is always really important to kind of sit and sort of recall is what a sense of adventure it took for a woman born in 1912, in a very, very conservative Pasadena family, which unless you're a California Republican, you really don't know how conservative and closed-minded that can be.
I think her dad was a John Bircher.
He was. Oh, wow. No, he was shockingly conservative. And I come from Orange County Republicans, which is a species of that thinking. And it's a very, very closed, very conservative way of life. And one of the things, Alex, that struck me when you were talking about how they were in Sri Lanka and they went out out and tasted food in the local community. And we think of doing that now, and it sounds like, well, of course you would do that. But that was quite a risky, adventurous thing. People would get sick. They fertilized food with what they euphemistically called night soil. They fertilized a lot of the vegetables that were grown then. I know, Catherine's looking. You can't see Catherine's furrowed brow.
So what is night soil?
Well, it's human waste.
Oh, my goodness.
So, for the two of them to sort of leave the compound and venture out together, I think really spoke just of their shared sense of curiosity and courage and, something we sort of take for granted now. But when I was writing my book, I was always really trying to put myself in that place at that time. And it really always kind of threw me back to realize how extraordinary the two of them were.
Well, and that place and that time was very particular. I mean, it was just during a war, World War, and there were people from all over the world meeting on this little island, at the bottom of India, and there was cuisine from all over the place. And so it wasn't just the local cuisine. It was Chinese, it was Malaysian, Indonesian, a lot of Western, and there were these little food stalls, and they used to go and graze their way through those food stalls. And like you said, in those days, it wasn't a thing that one did.
Right.
Yeah, you get a sense that neither one of them was holding the other one back from anything, that they were both willing to jump in together, whatever they were pursuing, was it food or travel or photography. Katie, the real star of this book, Frances of Feast, is the photography, Paul's photography. I'm curious, what was Julia's opinion of photography? Was she a fan? Did she?
Well, she was. She felt that she was more of a supporter of Paul's work, and she acted as a prop in his images, and she loved his work and was certainly wanted to see this book happen, but she wasn't a photographer or much of an artist herself, so I think she had a lot of admiration for Paul's talents.
She talks about how much fun it was to go on a shoot with Paul in Paris, and they would walk every weekend. They would walk all over Paris, and they would go to places that they didn't know. They wouldn't go on the familiar boulevards. They'd go on the little back alleyways and get lost and find their way back. And she loved it because she said looking at Paris through an artist's eye opened her up to all sorts of experiences that she would otherwise have missed, because her brain didn't work that way. She was not a particularly visual person. But Paul was very visual and constantly noticing things. And that, I think, informed her writing later on, particularly when she wrote in the mid-'70s. She wrote a book called From Julia Child's Kitchen, which was her very personal book, wrote in the first person and told personal stories. And you can see her picking out visual details in a way that she hadn't in her earlier writing. And I think that's one of the things that Paul brought to the table. The other thing that Katie mentioned, that Julia was a prop. And what that really means is that, she was 6'2", and he was about 5'8", and he would ask her to extend her arm and her fingers to block the sun from his lens so he could frame a shot that he wanted to.
That's such a great anecdote.
So she was a sunshade, basically.
Oh, my goodness. Well, and there was one photo I kept stopping on where it's a series of photos, but you see just her legs. And she has these long gamine legs, and
He used to call them her gams. Yeah, he loved her gams.
So she was a willing participant, maybe even a muse for him.
Very much a muse, yes.
She knew that he appreciated her legs, yeah.
The muse and the model, and he adored her, so he was happy to, celebrate her in his images. But I always think back when I look at the compositions with Julia in them that she was an object, she was an element to balance out his very formal compositions. So it's really very important that his images weren't just about a snapshot of Julia, but a beautiful work of art, a balanced, dark and black and white.
And I think also to to speak to sort of the formal composition of his images, Katie, is the pictures that Julia appears in. It seems that they have a warmth. So there were some of the sort of amazing, almost cubist compositions that she's not in, and then when you see her in some of them, even though you still have a lot of the formal architectural aspects, there's just this warmth of her being seen and him seeing her. That is kind of that is in those pictures that I think is quite extraordinary.
That's absolutely
Yes.
right. And I would also add that there are in this book a number of snapshots that are sort of taken on the fly. And Paul had a very sophisticated eye, so even the snapshots tend to be interesting visually.
Right.
But it's really fun to see. This book covers the years 1948 to 54 when they lived in Paris and Marseille. So this is when Julia was basically a housewife who was obsessed with food, strangely enough, and was learning to cook. So this was Julia becoming Julia Child.
Right.
And it's a kind of behind-the-scenes look. And so there's some funny pictures in here where she's, licking whipped cream off of a bowl, and she's, changing her clothes by the side of the highway, or she's, got
Very
her
candid.
legs up on the table, or playing with the cat. And then there's some much more formal, beautiful portraits. One of my favorite ones is a picture of Julia coming through a gate, a big metal gate with sunlight streaming in behind her, and it's just visually arresting. And so Paul, Katie can speak more to this, but Paul was always composing pictures in his mind's eye, and he, like Cartier-Bresson, he would wait for the exact moment and then snap the picture. And we forget today with our cell phones and everything that he couldn't review the picture he had just taken until it had been printed.
Right.
And so he had no idea what the picture was, and he'd have to wait and see and hope for the best.
Right. I think that again, this is my familiar song, but I think just putting ourselves back in that time with that kind of technology, and having to and film wasn't cheap, and processing, and it wasn't cheap, and they were living. He was a civil, or I guess in the foreign service, and also Paris at the time, it was still struggling after World War II for quite some time. So it wasn't like you could just bop into the photo mat and get these pictures developed. It was all quite a labor intensive process.
Yes, and expensive. Because
Exactly.
Paul had some of his film he had sent from the States. His brother would send him rolls of, I can't remember which brand, I want to say Agfa, but
Well, and he
it was very
didn't have the
expensive.
time because photography was a sidelight for him. His main job was working as a cultural attaché. He was very busy doing that. And so he didn't have time to work in the darkroom on his images, which is something he liked to do and he thought was important for any photographer to learn.
Sure.
But he hired a guy named Pierre Gassman, who he called Gassy, who was an unknown developer, but later turned out to be one of the great geniuses of that era.
Right.
And created a company called Pictorial Service, which still exists today, run by his grandson, I believe.
That's awesome.
And he did work for Cartier-Bresson and Brassai and people like that. And he introduced Paul to these, famous photographers of the day. And so Paul was really swimming in the same waters as these guys.
Right. Who took, one of the things that is famous among Paul and Julia is every year they would send out their Valentine's card, right? And there would be a picture of them. Who took those pictures? Was it an automatic?
It was a selfie.
selfie.
It was the first
On a
thing, right?
self-timer.
Paul was
Yeah.
very good at selfies.
Yeah.
Right. Catherine, tell us, or Katie, tell us about, so how many years did they do the Valentine's? I mean, it became an institution, right?
Yes, well, I don't know when they started, but they were definitely taking those pictures in the 50s.
Right. And there was the one of
And
them in the bathtub.
The bathtub,
Oh, I love that
and then
one.
there
That
were
is great.
There
Yeah.
were a few that they went to some photo studio and put on costumes and did some silly Valentine's ones
The
during
reason
those
they started
years.
doing it is they could never get it together to do a Christmas card.
Yeah,
So they started doing Valentine's cards.
I love that.
And Paul got really into it. And they did it for many years.
Right.
Probably, I would say, at least 20, maybe 30 years. I mean, there are many of them out there. And people seem to find them on eBay even now. But there were always had a sense of humor, but also a great sense of design.
Right, and that's the thing I think about them as a couple that is just so charming, and why they sort of continue to be this great kind of epitome of like the perfect romance is because they were both extraordinarily serious about what they did, but they always had the sense of play that sort of went along with it, that just makes it so charming and sweet.
Right. Yeah. Well, I wrote a book called The French Chef in America, which came out 2 years ago, and it's about the period after France when they were living in Cambridge. And in writing that book, I discovered a little section Julia had written in a book called Julia Child and Company, which came out in 1978. And it was entitled Child's Play. And I thought, oh, this will be a funny little ditty. It was like a little sidebar. And I read it, and I was like, wow, that's something interesting there. And I read it again, and she talks about the importance of being childlike and the importance of play, and not in a trivial sense, but in a creative sense, that if you're going to be a creative person, one needs to have that childlike sense of play in order to advance the art, so as not just to be reproducing the same thing over and over again by rote, but to actually move things forward.
And that seems like a very modern take. I mean, I think that's like, we talk about that today.
Yeah.
That you have to keep coming back to the page or the kitchen or the lab or whatever. But it always has to be with a sense of looseness and a sense of play and a willingness to improvise, which of course we know Julia was
the queen
famous.
of improvisation.
The queen of improvisation.
Exactly.
Well, I want to transition to our next course now. And Katie, Pratt, I would love to hear from you a little more about Paul's photography. And I was just struck in the book by, we've been talking about the sense of play and the sense of lightness. And in the book, there's so many just really engaging photos of Julia either eating or cooking. She's in the kitchen. She's in the act of creating beautiful food. But I don't see a lot of just food shots, which is, I feel like our society today, we're just overwhelmed with, Instagram photos of what people are eating for dinner or what they're cooking.
So many burritos.
There was just, getting back to our earlier conversation about the relationship, there's just so much warmth and love in these photos, and in these food photos, there's so much life. And I'm just curious, what's your opinion of the current food photography craze, and how would you contrast that with what Paul's approach was?
Well, the answer to the first part of your question, which is about there weren't that many photographs of Julia in the kitchen, or not, because Paul probably was busy making cocktails or eating the food or whatever, but also because the environment was like low light environment, or you'd have to turn on a flash, so it was not. I did see some photographs of him that he took of Julia in the kitchen, but they didn't come out that well. So he took a lot of photographs of her in later years, once her TV show started after 1962.
Well, also his photographs were used to illustrate Mastering the Art of French Cooking. It was too expensive and time-consuming to use actual photographs back in 1961, but the photographs formed the basis of the drawings that were done by Sidonie Corin for those books. And it was one of the innovations that Paul and Julia came up with in this wonderful love/working relationship they had together. Paul was a photographer, Julia's a cook. In those days, cookbooks were illustrated from the audience's perspective. And Julia thought it would be a good idea to illustrate, say, the trussing of a kitchen from the cook's perspective, because that's what her readers wanted. And so Paul got on a chair behind her and took photographs over her shoulder down at her hands, showing how she manipulated the chicken at various stages of the trussing. I found some letters where they're saying, oh, we just spent 3 hours in the kitchen having the best time. We're playing around with this new idea. And now that's something that they invented, and we take it for granted because almost all books now are illustrated that way. But it was just their collaboration and their intuitive sense of what their audience would want, and always trying to bring something new to the table.
So to speak.
as it were.
And that's so interesting what you were saying about sketching from photographs, because a couple of episodes ago we were talking about cookbook publishing, and one of the publishers who was on the panel was saying that food photography really dates cookbooks because the style changes from decade to decade, and the really only timeless way to illustrate a cookbook is with sketches.
Yeah.
So they were way ahead of the curve, as usual, with everything that we've discussed.
Yes, Paul's art is timeless, his drawings and his photographs. As for Instagram, I don't really use it very much just because I'm too busy doing other things. But I did take a look yesterday at the Instagram food sites, and there are thousands of images. So there's some beautiful shots. So
what do you guys think that Paul and Julia would make of the Instagram day era?
Well, I think Julia, she was a very level-headed Westerner, and I think when she thought things were silly, she was not afraid to say it. I can't imagine, I have heard from people, my friends that have restaurants and work in restaurants, that everyone's obsession with stopping their meal to take pictures of it. It slows down the kitchen. It slows down service. It slows down conversation. It's so, not...
It interrupts.
It interrupts,
Yeah.
and it's not, she was all about enjoyment from
and
soup
being in
to
the moment,
nuts.
too.
And being in the moment.
And it wasn't, her approach wasn't a sort of narcissistic one, which I think sometimes this obsessive food
Right.
photography, it becomes more about the person taking the picture. Look at me, look what I've got, look where I am, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
which
I would think
into.
she wouldn't. Paul might think it was interesting just from an intellectual perspective. Just
Yeah.
how does it? What does it? Say? About photography and the evolution of photography. But I just think Julie would think it was foolish, and the food's getting cold, and we.
On
should
the
all
other
have-
hand, I don't disagree with you. On the other hand, Julia was also all about getting people talking about food and
That's true.
trying it. And this certainly has turbocharged people's interest in food because we live in such a visual culture
Yeah.
now.
That's true.
This whole food obsession. I mean, I live in New York City where every time I go out, I see people taking pictures of their food, and I've sometimes done it myself. But it doesn't really interest me. I think you're right that ultimately she wouldn't be that interested. But I think that the larger message that food is worthy of conversation, she would approve of.
Right.
And I think Paul, and you can talk about this, Katie, but I think Paul was a bit of he set a very high standard for photography. And he used to always yell at Katie's mother for just taking a snapshot without looking at the backdrop first. He would always say,
If you don't have a good background, you won't have a good picture.
exactly.
Well, that's
yeah,
true.
right.
Or you have like the palm tree sticking out of your head,
Exactly,
right?
right. I think he would be, on the one hand, as you say, intellectually curious about photography now becoming so ubiquitous, and we have it on our phones.
But aesthetically,
I think
Yeah.
he would be
Yeah.
disappointed.
Well, I have to tell
Disgusted.
you, as a sidebar here, I was at a restaurant in New York last month, and when they came and explained the menu, they said, "And this appetizer is our most Instagrammable
Ew,
appetizer."
no. Oh,
yeah,
no, I'm harmed.
and we all looked at each
I
other.
apologize
as
for my city.
and we said, "Did he really just say this is the most Instagrammable?" Like telling us we're supposed to take a picture of the egg rolls or whatever it was.
Oh. Paul and Julia would not approve.
No, that was beyond the pale.
He was fishing for some free publicity, I
I
think.
don't know. Well, there are other. Well, whatever. But yeah, it was a little ridiculous modern moment.
Well, I've heard that actually chefs are now creating their dishes in order to be Instagrammable because
Yes.
of that very thing, because it generates hits and therefore interest, and then you get more people with their cameras showing up, and which is not really the point of, fine dining, really.
Right. But I think to your point that Julia, she came to the fore. I mean, my mother was a huge mastering the art of French cooking aficionado, and in fact, I grew up, like I said, in a suburb adjacent to Julia's, and I would just be begging her, like, can't we have taco night? Like all my friends, and we're like, oh no, beef bourguignon tonight, and it was hot. It was Southern California, and we would watch the French chef together, and My mother learned how to cook from that cookbook and just loved it. But it also got her away from, the frozen vegetables and the boxed potatoes, and because that was sort of right, in the time right before the cookbook came out. That was what housewives did. They made cake mixes. All you did was add water and an egg, and that was a cake. And
I don't know if you remember this, but in My Life in France, I tell this funny story about Julia's first cookbook being canceled by another publisher, Houghton Mifflin, because the editor said, the American housewife wants something simple with a mix, which was the exact opposite of Julia's approach.
Right.
And that's what she felt her heart drop, because it was just, oh no, I'm not even getting through to the publisher here. So maybe I'm just shouting into the void.
She eventually did, though.
She was ahead of her time. I mean,
got through to Judith Jones.
Yeah.
Well, so Judith Jones, her editor at Knopf, who was a legend, who Katie and I were lucky enough to know. She was sort of a Maxwell Perkins. She was perhaps the one editor in all of New York that understood that cookbook when it landed on her desk by these three anonymous women, one of whom was an American, two of whom were French. She took it home. Judith took it home and began to cook from it, and had discovered that this was the book she'd been looking for. Because like Julia, she had lived in Paris in the 50s. They had probably passed each other on the street. They never knew each other there, but learned to cook by going to the marketplace and talking to the butcher and talking to the baker and getting their recipes and taking it home and learning to cook. And so when she was back in New York, there were no books like this. And it suddenly, out of the blue, it arrived.
And
she
also no
understood
books that had actual measurements.
Right.
Like there would be a recipe that said that for gingerbread from the place in France where it said, and it would say beat it until your arm is tired. Like,
a dash of this and a splash of that. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, getting back to the Instagram discussion today, you can't get a cookbook contract unless you have 1 million Instagram and Twitter followers, and your blog has a huge following. And these were kind of unknowns who just sent this manuscript.
And they were women.
And they were women. Oh my goodness!
A real French chef is first of all a man, and second of all French. So,
exactly.
Julia was breaking all the rules.
Well, before we move on, I got to get back to Katie. I want to hear, Katie, about your experiences as a child learning how to draw from Paul Child. Wasn't he your earliest artistic instructor? I would love to hear about that.
Well, because I grew up in Cambridge and met them when I was 2, we were family friends.
Which is flat out amazing. It is flat. I just have to say, Katie, it is flat out amazing.
It was pretty special.
Right?
Yes. I can't complain. It was those were wonderful years. And when I was a teenager, Paul became my private teacher. So he'd come to my parents' house and give me lessons on drawing, painting, and special times. I can't say I'm a great artist.
Well, it also helped you
but
define your career today, right?
Yes, he helped train my eye, helped teach me how to observe and think about art and be a critical art thinker and curator.
And did you draw still lifes of food? I must ask.
No. No, we were drawing blocks of wood and objects, more like still lifes of vases and flowers and just traditional objects.
Well, there's an image in the book of he drew his hand.
Yes, he did. He did a drawing of his hand, and then he gave it to me as a sort of a lesson of this is how you draw light and shadow. And
right, and there's a big, on either side of the image, there's very careful notes about, just the care with which he wrote down everything that you had to do to create that image. I just thought that was amazing.
And that's how he was as a teacher. He was very organized and precise, and he would outline everything very carefully so that he could relate the information clearly so that I would get it, even when after he was gone. And
one of the things about Paul, though, is he also had a kind of a hard side to him and a very traditional side to him. And he felt that if you were going to be good at anything, you had to basically what we call today do the 10,000 hours. You had to do the hard work, and you had to learn to do those blocks of wood before you could take on the hand. And then once you did the hand, then you could do the landscape. And he said there's no substitute.
No shortcut.
Yeah, you can't take a shortcut to become an artist. And that people who think that they can just draw whatever and get into MoMA or something. They're just dilettantes, and he didn't take them seriously.
Yes.
And so there was a little bit of a kind of a rigorous
disciplinarian
side to him.
and classical approach to becoming good at any craft. I mean, he approached everything in his life with precision.
And they were
And
both
thoroughness.
They were both so diligent about these arts that in the beginning they thought were just hobbies. I mean, I don't think Julia realized that she would have this whole full career coming out of her cooking, but she was just as diligent about cooking as Paul was about art. So I'd love to move on to our third topic, our third course. I'd love to talk a little bit more about just their life philosophy, the way they've been able to, or the way they were able to just live life to the fullest by really sort of applying themselves to pleasure. Karen Karbo, I would love for you to share with us some of the life lessons you learned from the Childs while you were writing your book, Julia Child Rules.
Well, I'm a huge admirer of Julia's stamina, for starters. When I would read about her day, getting up at 6 a.m. to go to her course at the Cordon Bleu, and then she would, oftentimes even in Paris, they didn't have salt, so they would have to go out into the streets and come back, and then she would go home and cook Paul lunch, and they would have lunch together, and then she would cook all afternoon, and then she would go out to a lecture at night. And so, one of the great lessons I think from her life is that when you find your passion, that you should just throw yourself into it. You should definitely leap before you look. She was also big on following your whims. That a whim was something to be respected and followed. And I think that that's part of what gave her such joie de vivre, and such a life to her. The other thing too, when you look at their relationship, she actually had a suitor before Paul Child named Harrison Chandler, who was somebody that her family in California would approve of. He came from a very conservative family. In fact, they had founded the Los Angeles Times. And
that name, he sounds like a soap opera character.
Right. And he proposed to her, and she was of an age and a time where, she should get married. Like, it was in the cards for a woman of her breeding and her age. And she wanted to have an exciting life. She wanted to have a life of meaning, and she wanted to have a partner who sort of understood her and also helped her develop her interests, which she I think coming from where she came from and also not being sort of like a trained scholar or anything, she was definitely the party girl and not the academic when she was at Smith. All of these things she wanted in a partner, and I think she thought, if I cannot find that, I can go alone into the world and make a better life for myself, which was quite brave. And also I think it required her to have a lot of confidence in herself. And when you look at Julia being so tall and having that kind of, eccentric voice and being a woman of that time, all of that took a phenomenal amount of self-confidence and courage. So I think that that's something else that we can learn from her. I mean, now, of course, she's in our mind, she's just this sort of great singular force for pleasure and nature and loving life. But, when she was a young woman, I think it just took a lot of courage for her to sort of move on with things. And then she and Paul, though, became reacquainted. When they left Sri Lanka, they were sort of on friendly terms, but it was not romantic. Is that correct, Alex?
Hard to know.
Right?
I don't think it was if there was any romance, it may have been very unserious.
Because I feel like,
he had plenty of girlfriends.
He had girlfriends,
Yeah.
and also wasn't it like, Julia, Susie isn't, returning my messages. What should I
Right.
do? Wasn't she like that kind of a friend?
A little bit.
But they became reacquainted then through their letters.
Well, they also were posted to China together in Kunming, and that's where the relationship really blossomed. And again, it was over food. They used to go to these restaurants where there were no other Westerners. And I remember her telling me a story. There was a restaurant that had a big atrium, and they would lower the food on baskets down into the dining hall, which was kind of this mass of people. And they just thought it was so exotic. It was like going to another planet or something. And they just loved it. And in fact, they often thought of Chinese food as their second favorite after French. But I like what you were saying about her romantic prospects in Los Angeles. Her parents very much wanted her to get married, and she saw this Chandler guy and people liked them and said, oh, if I'd gotten married to him, I would have become an alcoholic like some of my friends. And, she just knew instinctually that wasn't right for her.
Right.
And as you said, she had this great self-confidence and she also had an incredible talent. Her instincts were so good when she took advantage of her whims, as you put it, it was based on this incredible instinct that she had. It often, I've noticed in her life and in her career, she would reach an impasse of some kind, and she would be befuddled for a minute, and then she'd figure out a way around it, and then she'd go off in another direction, usually to greater acclaim than ever. And not everybody can do that.
Correct. That's a good
point. And it's,
point.
her resilience is just remarkable. Yeah.
The other thing she said that I remind myself of is all you need is a kitchen and a bedroom. So the point being is that, this is where pleasure takes place and that all of the other things that we sort of worry about and fret about will take care of themselves.
I love their bravery in carving out a life that really was sort of geared toward pleasure. And yet it wasn't, it's not like there's some people who just kind of live lazy lives and they just want to enjoy themselves. But they really went after pleasure. And they were very...
They worked very hard.
They worked very hard.
And I think that's where, if something is your passion, that's what you want to do. And they were blessed to find each other and to be able to do it together. And to sort of echo, what Alex said earlier is that, the idea that, yes, he was kind of the alpha partner for half of their marriage. And then he really stepped aside and allowed her to flourish. And given really what a great artist he was. He wasn't just a dabbler. He really was a phenomenal artist. And yet to be able to step aside for this woman that he loved and really sort of help support her and help her succeed, I think is quite extraordinary.
It must be said they didn't have children. They tried, and as she said, it didn't take. And I kept trying to push her on that. I said, well, did you think of adoption? Nope. Did you think of in vitro? Nope. She just didn't want to go there. And then later she said to me, had I had children, I would not have had my career. So there was some self-knowledge there. And the same was true of her partner, Simca Beck. They didn't have children either. And I think she understood on some very instinctual level that she was that her career, her books, her shows, those were her children, which is pretty profound,
And I don't think it was. And I don't think it was without sadness. Like
Oh, yeah,
and
sure.
again, I didn't. I'm saying this as someone who has researched her and interviewed people. But my sense was that she was very aware that there was a little component of having missed something, but she wasn't going to let that slow her down. So she wasn't like sort of well defended from it. Like she fully knew that it was something she had missed out, but it didn't let her.
Well, I found some letters where she and Simca are talking about this, and she says, "Ah, ma chérie, we won't have our daughters to look after us in old age, but we shall carry on."
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Which they did. They
Exactly.
were both these kind of strong-willed women who just, that's the way it is, and
Right.
carry on.
And they were beloved, and Julia certainly had plenty of friends in Santa Barbara.
Well, and I was lucky. I was sort of a beneficiary of this because they didn't have children. But they treated my sisters and my cousins and me as sort of surrogate grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
So we would see them in Cambridge or New York or in Maine or in France or wherever, and we were always just brought into her force field. And I never really had a cooking lesson with her per se, but if you were anywhere near Julia, and Katie can tell you, you were put to work. Okay, you chop the butter and you wash the lettuce and you go help Paul bring the wine up from the cave. And, it was just it's what you did. And it wasn't like she sat you down and said, okay, you're going to learn how to make chocolate chip cookies. No, it was just get in the kitchen, help out, and then enjoy the fruits of your labor. And it was even doing the dishes. It was fun,
Well, I feel like I was treated as one of her surrogate children. We say grandchildren, but they Julia and Paul both just embraced they loved younger people and treated us like family, and it was really special.
Yeah. We were lucky.
But yeah, we were lucky. We were very lucky. I just came across some postcards that Julia had sent me. I have all these postcards she sent me over the years, and just checking in on me because I left the East Coast for the West Coast 32 years ago, and she was just making sure I was okay, encouraging me in my different path.
Yeah, and I was going to bring up your different path. The three of you, it seems to me, are kind of living Childian lives yourselves. You've all sort of pursued your passions and made your careers out of your passions.
That's
Katie,
true.
you're a photography curator. That just sounds so cool and interesting.
Yes, I feel like I'm channeling Paul a lot because I love working with photography. I love doing exhibitions and promoting other artists. And I also like being creative myself. I hope to do more of my own art now that this book is out there in the world.
And there was an accompanying exhibition at the Napa Valley Museum, is that correct?
Yes. After the book was off at the printing press at the publisher, I talked to Alex and others involved and suggested that we do an exhibit because there are so many wonderful images, and wouldn't it be even better if people can walk through these images and feel like they're in Paris or in Paul's studio or in Julia's kitchen. So that was my intent in creating that exhibit, and it's been well received.
It's at the Napa Valley Museum in Yountville. If anybody gets up to California, down to California,
Napa Valley.
And they'll be there till
May 20th.
May 20th.
Oh, so maybe just a few days after this episode goes live, but people will still have some time to run in and see it. And I hope that it someday travels to another museum. I would love to see
We hope
this.
that it will travel around to major museums in this country and maybe even to France.
Yeah, I would love to see those photos up close. They're so enjoyable in the book form.
It's a great show. Well, the photos, they speak for themselves. They're beautiful, and they transport you to that time and place. And Paul really was able to capture the essence of what he was experiencing.
Well, so Alex, were you inspired to become a writer by Julia and Paul?
I think partly, yeah. One of the things that used to happen is that Paul and Julia would take us out to dinner wherever we were, in New York or Cambridge or somewhere. And you'd go into a restaurant, and they would always put you at the biggest table in the middle of the dining room, of course, to show you off. And then people would start coming up and talking to her. And she was very gracious, and she asked them about their lives, and it was a genuine interest. And then after a while, we'd have to say, okay, please leave us alone. We need to eat. And then after the meal, we would go back into the kitchen, and she would talk to literally every single person, starting with the head chef, whose story she generally knew, and then working her way down the line till she got to the dishwasher, and that person's story she didn't know, and she would spend the most time talking to him or her. And she'd say, now, who are you? What's your name? How did you get here? What are your dreams? What do you want to do? And she had so much fun, and she got these people to tell these unbelievable stories. And I think as a little kid watching that must have lodged in the back of my mind. And Paul was a wonderful writer. He was a more natural writer than Julia. And in fact, he was kind of her first editor always, and he really tutored her. And so I grew up in that milieu of food and wine and words and images. And for me, it wasn't a big leap to become a writer. Paul and his brother, my grandfather, were painters and photographers. My mother's a painter. I could very easily become a painter myself, but there was something about the specificity of words that I liked, and I like storytelling. And I think having Julia in the family, it wasn't a direct influence, but I think it was a subconscious influence that, hey, you can actually make a good living and have a lot of fun doing this. And for me, that was much more appealing than a sort of standard career. And I will say it's not always easy, nor was it for Paul and Julia, but it is definitely satisfying.
Am I next?
Well,
I'm next. You're going around the table?
Sure.
You're going around the foretop here? Well, I have to say, I came from, like I said, the same pond as Julia did. Not the same socioeconomic status, but that blazing Southern California situation where, if you think about it, there aren't you hear about women from California, and you don't hear about a lot of like intellectuals and women that have contributed greatly to the culture. Hollywood, sure, actresses and entertainment. So the idea, and I learned very young because I learned in my mother's knee all about Julia Child, that this girl from California can avail herself of the larger world. You could go to New York. Even when in the 70s, I would go to New York and people, I remember once being at a party and I overheard someone talking about me, and I dressed up for the occasion, and they looked me up and down, and they said to their friend, "Out of town." Like they could tell I was from California. They're like, yeah, she's not a New Yorker. So the idea that you could embrace that kind of city and culture, and you could also go to Paris, and Paris, you could also be a Californian in Paris. You could also go around as Julia did, and just with her warmth and her enthusiasm, sort of talk to go to the boulangerie, go to the fromagerie, talk to these people, charm them with her, horrible French at first, that you could be that person. Was a huge influence to me because my father was a Polish emigre. My mother was a housewife. Like we did not, I did not come from, other than, my father's people were sort of, from the petty bourgeoisie in Warsaw. But I did not have anything like that other than someone like Julia, to show me that you could actually, go out into the larger world and sort of make it your own. So I was hugely influenced by her in that regard.
Oh, what a lovely place to wind up the show and move on to our dessert course, where we each share something foodie or beverage related that we have been enjoying this week. I'll go first. I was probably the last person on the planet to see this, but I finally got a chance to see Wasted, Anthony Bourdain's feature-length documentary about food waste. Have you all seen this?
Yep.
Yeah.
It is available to stream on Amazon, iTunes, and I think some other places. It's great. I highly recommend everyone watch it. I love the way, actually getting back to the topics of today, I love the way that they, Bourdain and his producers, they used art to sort of tie together the different segments of the film. They have an artist creating art that represents what they're talking about, and it just keeps you visually engaged. The only kind of odd note now, given the time, is that Mario Batali has a major role in the film, and given all the controversy, you kind of see him up there, and you're like, him again? Did he really need to get so much camera time? I don't know, but it's a great film, and I recommend everyone go check it out. Katie, did you bring a dessert item for us today?
Well, I brought a food recipe.
Oh, great.
Because in Napa, where I live, our farmers markets have started. So I have 2 farmers markets a week now, which makes me happy. So asparagus is in season, and I just love buying fresh asparagus and taking it home and roasting it. And drizzle it with olive oil, roast it in the oven, salt and pepper.
Or on the grill. It's really good.
Doesn't it fall through the little... Oh, you have
so
to put
delicious.
People forget that you can roast spring vegetables. People think that you can only roast winter vegetables.
Bake, and it's just one of my annual treats. I love it. So that's my dessert.
Very healthy dessert. Thank you. Alex, what did you bring for us?
Well, I'm working on a new book, which was inspired by some episodes in Julia's career. It's a history of food at the White House.
Ooh.
And in 1967 and 1976, Julia took her cameras into the White House at state dinners and took them into the kitchen. And there's a whole fascinating and hilarious story behind those two in my book, The French Chef in America. But that got me thinking about the importance of the food of politics and the politics of food. And I have been spending the last few months going back, starting with George Washington starving at Valley Forge, about to lose the Revolution, and working my way forward up until the current occupant of the White House, looking at moments through history when food played a central role. And you look at the things that people used to eat, like a possum or turtle soup.
Oh, now I'm hungry.
The kinds of things that we just don't eat anymore. But they tell us, and not to mention these wonderful banquets and little snacks, and it tells us about these national leaders as human beings with individual quirky tastes. It also tells us about the State of the Union, where were we as a nation at that point, and how does food relate? What was going on? And so I guess my dessert is that I'm looking at American history through the lens of food, and it's absolutely fascinating. And there's a lot of stuff online. If people are interested, you can just go on and start Googling around. But I have come up with some really great anecdotes, so I look forward to sharing that with everybody probably in a year and a half or 2 years.
That's so interesting because so many pundits these days make comments about our current president's taste in food, fast food to be specific. It really does kind of say something about the person, what they eat.
Well,
so
if you think about our appetites as human beings, it tells us a lot about ourselves. And you think of food choices almost as a window into the soul. It gets pretty deep. And you look at some of the cultural aspects around food, such as gender, race, religion. It's really fascinating, and you understand that something like slavery has played a crucial role in American history in the White House kitchen from the very beginning.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not something that is really taught in schools. And I guess I had a vague idea about this stuff, but now that I've been researching it, I realize how important the subject is and how fascinating it is. So I can't wait to get this book out in the world.
Can't wait to read
Sounds
it.
Can't
great.
wait.
Karen, do you have some dessert for us?
I have a literal dessert that is based on Julia's tarte tatin, which is my favorite thing to eat. If I was going to be executed, that would be my last thing I would have, and I would eat the whole thing. But so we make it at our house a lot, except for it's kind of a two-man operation. Those of you that have tried to make it, you make it in a big cast iron skillet. And the apples are caramelized on the bottom, and then you put the pastry dough on top. So when it comes out of the oven, you've got to do this flipperoo thing that sometimes it winds up on the floor. If you're not, you got to get the so anyway, if you're by yourself and you don't have a helper to hold the dish while you flip over the cast iron skillet, you can actually make a hand galette, an apple hand galette, using Julia's recipe for the pastry dough. You cut it you roll it out, you cut it in quarters. You mix up apple slices with lemon and sugar and a little cinnamon, and you put it in the middle, and then you put it on a cookie sheet. You fold it up. You put a little wash of egg yolk. You put some sugar on it, and they make these beautiful little hand pies that you can just eat and pass out to friends. And it's sort of my deconstructed tarte tatin.
Making me very hungry.
I have to tell you a Julia tarte tatin story because one of her most infamous episodes was the tarte tatin. And you can find it there's some DVDs out, and there's the tarte tatin show. But you'll see this story where she's demonstrating the tarte tatin in black and white. And she didn't listen to her producer who told her she better try this out beforehand. She said, "Oh, no, it'll be just fine." So she makes the tarte tatin, and she brings it out of the oven and flips it over and goes, ta-da! And as she raises the pan, instead of a beautiful caramelized dessert, what appears as a puddle of brown mush. And you see her eyebrows going up to the top of her forehead. She goes, "Oh, that's a little loose." And now you can show your friends what a great genius you are. You sift some sugar over it, run it under the broiler, and it'll come out just fine. And you can see her. She's a little flustered, but of course Julia said, "Never apologize."
That's
she never
right.
apologized. She carried on. She made the best of this mess, and it became a teachable moment. But the thing that's really funny about this is that years and years later, when she and I were working on her memoir together, she was still mad about that tarte tatin, and she was muttering. She's like, "I think somebody switched the apples on me, that those weren't the right apples that they sold me." As if somebody was out to get her, you know?
Were the apples stuck to because sometimes the apples
No,
get
they
stuck
were
inside.
mush.
Oh,
It was
they
like applesauce. They had
Alex, I think those must have been the wrong apples because I have substituted and
Yeah.
it doesn't. They just don't hold up.
exactly. Right. It's all in the apples.
It is. Well, it is.
She had a hard
important.
time with apples. She and apples did not get along.
Well, actually, she she also, from mastering the art of French cooking to the way of cooking, she also modified her recipe. And one of my great college friends and I got into our biggest fight over Julia's tarte tatin. I said, no, you do it this way. And we had, in fact, the two different cookbooks.
You're both right.
So we were. And
you're both wrong.
It saved the friendship. It saved the friendship.
Well, everyone's right today, and I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you, panelists. Karen Karbo, how many books have you written? Well, I tried to count, and I think I counted 15.
I think that's right.
Including the Kick-Ass Women series.
That's right,
which
of
includes
which Julia's one.
Julia book. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so. And my newest book, which just came out, is In Praise of Difficult Women.
Ooh,
Julia
like
was
that
not
title.
a difficult woman. I mean, she was difficult in her way, but she was mostly a lovely woman.
Well, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And Katie Pratt, co-author of the book France is a Feast and curator of the accompanying exhibition, which you can still see at the Napa Valley Museum for just a few more days. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
And Alex Prud'homme, author of, is it 7 books?
Yep.
Great, or the great nephew of Julia Child.
Correct.
Did I get that right? And I can't wait to read your culinary history of the White House.
Yeah, me neither.
Thanks for being here.
Oh, merci and bon appétit.
Bon appetit.
Here's to us, none better.
Exactly.
Today's episode was recorded in the high-fiber, protein-packed city of Portland, Oregon, in the studios of OPB. You can read all about us on the OPB website. Our sound supervisor today was Zach Carver-Gustin, and our theme music was performed by the incomparable wine importer Kermit Lynch. People, if you like our James Beard Award-winning show, please rate us on iTunes, subscribe to The Four Top on your favorite podcast app, and tell your friends about us. You can tweet us at @4top, check out our Instagram or visit our Facebook page and post your thoughts about the show. We would love to hear from you. Au revoir.
Nuit blanche, nuit blanche, nuit